I went to meet the writer James Barclay. He's written 2 trilogies, Chronicles of the Raven and Legends of the Raven. His brand of fantasy is described as high, meaning it is set in its own world, like Lord of the Rings, that whilst it has to be entirely coherent, differs from low fantasy that is set in the real world, but with elements of magic, such as Harry Potter. James is also president of the British Fantasy Society. The very fact that there is such a thing I find slightly amazing, as if to elevate the genre to the ranks of the Royal College of Physicians or the British Academy. Afterwards, a friend lent me a boat to take on the river, weather permitting. Rivers do feature very highly as place or, for fantasy literature, don't they?
Yeah.
Why is that, do you think?
But there's a romance to boat and river travel, and again, that feeds into the whole sort of fantasy vibe too, and I think that's...
Yes, there is. And rivers flow, and I suppose that gives them a narrative.
Yes, really absolutely. They're never the same.
Yeah. You merely have to put 2 people
changing and
on
evolving,
a boat,
absolutely, yeah.
And there you almost have a journey. Sooner or later, their horses are going to give out, aren't they? They're going to have to get on the boat.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, got to rest the horses.
Yeah. So, what do you think it is about British fantasy writers that makes us so prolific in the genre?
I think it's down to the huge mix of cultures and mythologies that we've gathered together over the course of centuries. Celtic, Norse, German. I mean, whether by conquest or invasion, that doesn't really, it kind of almost doesn't matter.
But also we've sort of added something of ourselves to that. Although we've got lots of cultural identities, there does seem to be a type of British fantasy which is British, which is
yeah.
different from anything else in the world. And in your view, what is that? What are the...
I think we've got these sort of romantic ideals of perfection and rurality, and if you go back to feudalism and to the sort of the medieval ideals and those sort of things. But I think at its heart, what we don't like is this idea of our rural idyls under threat, and that's a very British thing to protect this sort of purity, and that comes out in many fantasy books. But you add that to the mix of the laws and the myths that we've gathered from all over, particularly all over Europe, and you get this huge, rich mix of beauty and romance and malevolence and threat, and it's the perfect mix, the perfect recipe, if you like, for a fantasy writer to use. It's just this massive sort of bunch of tools that you can just gather just bits from. It's a huge. It's just a great sort of smorgasbord of stuff you can bring in.
What about the sort of the quirkiness, though? What about the more playful elements?
Well, but I think all that does is add to the realism and the credibility of things, and things. You have to have stuff which isn't serious and desperately important and hand on, sort of fist on the heart, so it's sort of incredible plot driving stuff. You need to have all these elements to make your piece of work complete. But I think in fantasy you can be more quirky and more interesting because you can draw on a much wider set of a much wider set of rules, because you're making your rules for your book.
Apart from crashing my friend's boat on the way back and all the grovelling I had to do, I think it went well. There was actually nothing half so much worth doing as simply messing about on boats, to paraphrase Ratty. And James gave me a lot of food for thought. There is certainly something in our turbulent past and our national geography that has produced a very particular set of national characteristics, a quirkiness and humour that lends itself to the genre.